Last week, an undisclosed number of U.S. Air Force B-2 Spirit stealth bombers engaged hardened underground weapons facilities inside Yemen in the aircraft's first ever combat operations targeting Houthi forces. According to the Defense Department, the B-2s were a part of a broader operation aimed at destroying weapons Houthi rebels have been using to indiscriminately attack civilian, commercial, and even military vessels traversing the international waters of the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden in recent months. But based on the Houthis' lack of significant air defense capabilities, the use of these stealth bombers suggests there's more to this story than meets the eye. Because while the primary objective of this mission was to wipe out Houthi weapon stockpiles, the secondary objective was almost certainly to send a 30,000-pound bunker-busting message to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So let's talk about that message, the B-2 Spirit, and the weapon only it can carry, the massive ordnance penetrator. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. According to media reports, North Korea is deploying thousands of troops to Ukraine to support Russian forces in their ongoing invasion. And recent footage that surfaced online of North Korean troops being issued Russian uniforms and equipment certainly seems to substantiate these claims. But we're still not entirely clear on just how many troops are actually headed to the fight, with some outlets reporting figures as high as 10 or even 15,000 troops, and others reporting as few as 1,500 special operations soldiers. And the truth is, we likely won't know for sure for some time to come, and you better believe I'll be using ground news to keep tabs on this story. Ground News is an aggregator that collects news stories published by outlets all around the world and places them all into a single easy-to-read feed, making it easier than ever to not only stay on top of what's going on in the world, but also to see through the different kinds of bias that are so commonplace in today's news coverage. Right here on Ground News, I can see that 249 outlets have already covered this story, including 40 left-leaning, 31 right-leaning, and 37 centrist ones. And as I scroll down the page, I can not only compare headlines, but I can very quickly and easily see who owns an outlet, what their factuality rating is, and what their political leanings are. And with this story, it would seem that left-leaning outlets are leaning harder into sensationalism and hyperbole, running headlines like "War in Ukraine, deployment of North Korean troops would be an unprecedented escalation." Whereas many right-leaning outlets used more reserved language, like "North Korean troops in Russia ready for combat in Ukraine." Ground News also makes it easy for you to keep tabs on your own news consumption with things like their My News Bias page, which will give you a breakdown of the political affiliations, the ownership, and even the geographic regions that your own news consumption tends to focus on. Ground News is an invaluable part of my research and my daily news consumption, and it can be for you too for a great deal. Just go to ground.news/sandboxx with 2 X's to get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use every day. Again, that's ground.news/sandboxx to get 40% off their Vantage plan to help you stay on top of things. Last week's American strikes against Houthi forces inside Yemen came amid heightened tensions all throughout the region, as Israel's ongoing and controversial military operations against the terror group known as Hamas, operating inside Israeli-occupied Gaza, has boiled over into a widespread offensive that some have come to characterize as a genocide of the Palestinian people. That offensive, spurred by a Hamas-led terror attack on Israeli civilians just over a year ago, has since given Iran-backed extremist organizations impetus to launch attacks on Israeli, American, and other partner nations under the guise of support for the increasingly desperate Palestinian population. Now, the Houthis, like Hamas and Hezbollah, are Iranian-backed, trained, and funded militant groups that Iran uses to advance its foreign policy aims while maintaining a degree of plausible deniability, in a somewhat similar methodology to Russia's own infamous PMC Wagner. Using these allegedly independent groups to conduct combat operations on foreign soil diffuses responsibility away from the nation actually devising and funding the attacks. Now, the Defense Department has released very few details regarding the B-2's actual role in these airstrikes, including the number of aircraft involved, the air bases they operated out of, or the types of munitions they used. Initially, there was some discussion that the stealth bombers may have been carrying the massive and uniquely American 30,000-pound GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, a bunker-busting bomb that can only be carried by the B-2. But subsequent reports suggest that this was unlikely, and instead, they probably deployed smaller 5,000-pound bunker busters like the GBU-72B. But the truth is, the finer details of the B-2 operations last week are just not as important, geopolitically speaking, as the message the use of these aircraft sent to Iranian officials. And that message definitely included the GBU-57, even if it wasn't a part of the payload. Now, the Houthis aren't without air defense capabilities whatsoever. They do have a variety of legacy Soviet-era systems, like the SA-2, SA-3, SA-6, and SA-9. The SA-3 notably being the surface-to-air missile system that took down an American F-117 Nighthawk, the world's first operational stealth aircraft over Yugoslavia back in 1999. But realistically speaking, none of these systems, nor any of the Iranian-sourced hardware the Houthis have bolstered their air defenses with in recent years, like the Sayyad 2C, could really hold the B-2 Spirit at risk with proper mission planning. And that tells me that the decision to use B-2s for these airstrikes can probably be attributed to a combination of two things. The first is minimizing risk to American troops. Sure, the B-2 is overkill against Houthi air defenses, but why not use it if you've got it? And the second was to send a very specific message, not to the Houthis, but to their financial benefactors in Iran. Providing Iran with a stark reminder of America's ability to hold even heavily fortified underground bunkers at risk was all but certainly among the primary objectives for this operation. Iran has moved large facets of its nuclear weapons research, along with weapons storage facilities, command and control, and even entire air bases underground in recent decades, all meant to shield them from Israeli or American attack. Perhaps among the most important of these subterranean structures are the nuclear enrichment facilities at Natanz, some 180 miles, or around 300 kilometers, south of Tehran. In 2009, the US revealed previously classified intelligence showing Iranian forces burrowing deep into the Zagros Mountains near the facility as part of the nation's ongoing effort to move nuclear centrifuges deeper underground than American buster-busting munitions could reach. To put it simply, Iran is betting that by stuffing their most vital command elements, military assets, and nuclear research programs hundreds of feet below the Earth, they'll be safe from American airstrikes. A notion the B-2 Spirits deployed last week all but certainly aimed to dispel. Because while the 5,000-pound bunker busters employed last week are reportedly potent enough to reach targets buried beneath upwards of 150 feet of earth, or at least 15 feet of reinforced concrete, the 30,000-pound GBU-57 MOP is said to be capable of burrowing through well more than 200 feet of earth and more than 25 feet of solid reinforced concrete. In fact, there are no publicly available figures as to just how deep the MOP can reach, but most assessments suggest that it's likely much deeper than even those figures reflect. There's straight up just not many places on Earth, or even beneath it, where the MOP can't reach you. And not only is the B-2 the only aircraft that can carry this weapon, but the B-2 can carry 2 of them. So let's make like the mop and dive a bit deeper into this weapon system. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator is a downright massive GPS-guided bomb that consists of a BLU-127 warhead case and a KMU-612 tail kit that houses a GPS navigation system just like you'd find in America's JDAMs or Joint Direct Attack Munitions. The tail has 4 active lattice fins that deploy when the weapon is dropped and are powered by separate actuators to guide the bomb into its target coordinates with a high degree of precision. The original weapon's designation was the GBU-57AB, followed by the GBU-57B, GBU-57CB, GBU-57DB, GBU-57EB, and GBU-57FB. But what changes each of these new designations actually reflect remains largely classified. At only around 20.5 feet long and with a diameter of roughly 31.5 inches, the MOP is only a little bigger than a Tomahawk cruise missile, but weighs in at nearly 10 times as much, at right around 27,125 pounds, more than 5,300 pounds of which is all explosives, made up of around 4,590 pounds of AFX 757 and another 752 pounds of a newer explosive called PBXN 114. Now that AFX 757, the primary explosive found in the MOP, is a propellant-like plastic explosive compound that was developed specifically to maximize blast energy output for bunker buster bombs just like the MOP. Of course, for a 30,000-pound weapon, you might be surprised to hear that the warhead itself only represents about 20% of its total weight. With no means of onboard propulsion or fuel storage needs, that means the immensely dense and hardened fuselage of the weapon itself, designed to bore directly through even the most secure underground structures, weighs in at north of 20,000 pounds. Now, these super strong casings are 3.05 inches thick, and they were built by Superior Forge and Steel Corporation out of Lima, Ohio, and Elwood National Forge in Irvine, Pennsylvania, to the tune of around $90 million for the initial tooling and first production batch. Now, testing of the GBU-57 started in New Mexico's White Sands Missile Range back in March of 2007, and by October of 2009, the Pentagon issued an urgent request to Congress to reallocate funds to rapidly source 4 of these weapons through concurrent production, meaning that those first 4 MOPs were built while testing was still underway, and then to integrate them into the B-2 Spirit. Now, just how many of each MOP variant, or how many MOPs in all the US maintains at any given time, remains shrouded in mystery. According to Air Force procurement documentation, 8 weapons were purchased in fiscal year 2009, and by September of 2011, it was reported that Boeing, the weapons prime contractor, had delivered 20 complete MOPs in all. It remains unclear how many additional weapons have been procured, but we do know that there have been several production runs since then. We also know that in 2012, the same year, the US revealed Iran's deep subterranean nuclear enrichment facility near Natanz may reach as deep as 300 feet below the surface, that the Pentagon allocated another $82 million, roughly $114 million in today's currency, to improve the bomb's penetration capabilities. In January of the following year, the Pentagon announced that this effort was successful, but disclosed no further details. It is, however, worth noting that the weapon's generally accepted 200-foot penetration depth is based on Air Force claims made prior to this upgrade, all the way back in 2007. Now, the most recent MOP upgrades came at around the same time as additional procurements were announced back in 2018. Now, what exactly most of this slew of upgrades included is classified, but we do know that they were collectively called Enhanced Threat Response 4, or ETR 4 weapon modifications, and one of those improvements was a new fuse system. Now, designing a fuse that can withstand being dropped from high altitude and then penetrating through hundreds of feet of earth is a huge challenge, and an improved fuse could not only make the weapon more safe and reliable, it could feasibly allow it to penetrate even further without detonating prematurely. Now, according to reports from the war zone, the inert version of the BLU-127CB, the bomb portion of newer MOPS, actually houses something known as a booster. But they couldn't be certain whether this booster is a form of propulsion, like a rocket booster, or is a term used to describe some other type of penetration aid, like a small explosive charge that enables the detonation of the main charge. And to be honest, I'm not sure what to make of it either, but I wanted to include it so you can decide for yourself. We also know that 3 MOPS were expended over the White Sands Missile Range for testing in 2018, with 3 B-2s each dropping a single weapon on known targets. The Pentagon released no details regarding these tests, except that they were all successful. According to Army Lieutenant Colonel Michelle Baldanza, a spokesperson for the Pentagon's testing office, they, quote, demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness. And that was all she'd say. It's particularly worth noting that the U.S. has demonstrated the ability to drop multiple bunker busters on the exact same location using the same GPS guidance systems found throughout the MOP line of weapons. And this allows American aircraft to strike targets that are even deeper than their bunker busters will allow for individually, effectively by hitting the crater created by the first weapon with a second, and then a third, and so on in rapid succession. The B-2 Spirit can carry a whopping 16 2,000-pound GBU-31 bunker busters that can be used in this very manner, but a single B-2 could also carry 2 30,000-pound MOPS to engage multiple targets or one very deep one. With multiple B-2s involved, as we saw in last week's operation, you could feasibly hit the same target with several MOPS to ensure complete destruction of targets, even at the most extreme of depths. Alright, so now that we know the basics of the MOP, let's close out by briefly summarizing how this weapon would be used by B-2 Spirits engaging targets inside Iran. Now, details about last week's B-2 airstrikes against Houthis remain pretty murky, but it's likely that these aircraft departed from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, which is home to all 19 of America's operational stealth bombers. In an attack against Iran's subterranean nuclear facilities near Natanz, this would also likely be the starting point. But to be clear, B-2s have been known to operate from a variety of air bases all around the world for different missions. Now, we are not talking about white-knuckle flying. After departing Whiteman, the 2-person B-2 crew would have a long and daunting flight ahead of them as they covered the nearly 7,000 miles to their targets at a cruising speed of roughly 550 to maybe 600 miles per hour, about the same speed as a commercial airliner, with the most direct route possible, which wouldn't be possible due to mission requirements and in-flight refueling. They'd be staring down the barrel of a roughly 24-hour round trip, and in reality, it would almost certainly be significantly more. Now that means mission planning would include much more than just route planning and threat mitigation. You see, unlike other strategic bombers, like say the B-52, which flies these long-duration missions with a crew of 5, including 2 pilots, 2 navigators, and an electronic warfare officer, America's stealth bomber splits all of these duties up between just the 2 pilots on board. I'm going to quote B-2 pilot Lieutenant Colonel Nikki Rogue Politer. When you're faced with a 24-hour mission or a long-duration mission, you really get into the details of who is going to do what task and how we're going to manage our sleep. You see, both pilots need to be awake, alert, and in their seats, not just for the combat operation, but for things like in-flight refueling, which, depending on weather conditions and visibility, can be a very stressful ordeal. So the plan has to account for rest to make sure that neither pilot is falling asleep at the stick by the time they reach their target area. And according to Captain Caleb James, a doctor with the 509th Medical Group, medications are issued to these pilots to help them, quote, stay focused on the mission when mission requirements or the rigors of combat just won't let them get any sleep during the flight. But these marathon missions aren't exactly unfamiliar territory for B-2 crews. In fact, the B-2 Spirit holds the record for the longest bombing mission in history between Whiteman Air Force Base and a target area over Afghanistan and then back, spanning a mind-numbing 44 hours of flight time. As Captain Chris Thunder Beck, who flew long-duration bomber missions in the B-52 before transitioning to the B-2, put it, your mind doesn't know what to think at that point. You're just awake. Now, the B-2 could feasibly cover most of a direct flight to Iran on a single tank of gas, thanks to its unrefueled range of some 6,900 miles. But while carrying a pair of 30,000-pound bunker busters, these aircraft would likely need to meet up with tankers every 6 hours as they traversed the globe. Now, flying the direct route would take the aircraft over several friendly nations, but several not-so-friendly ones as well, like Russia. So chances are good that the overall distance covered would be significantly greater than a straight shot. And once the B-2s entered Iranian airspace, the route would become especially complex, as the aircraft flew along pre-planned routes meant to avoid the most capable integrated air defense systems, taking care to manage not just their relative position in relation to those systems, but also their relative altitude and even the angle of the aircraft that they present to long-range radar arrays. Every step of the flight would be meticulously planned to lean into the B-2's low observability to maximize their chances of success and of survival. As these B-2s approached the heavily defended airspace around Natanz, they could feasibly deploy their massive bunker buster mops from as far out as 24 miles, allowing the weapon's forward momentum to carry them the remaining distance, while the GPS guidance-controlled tail fins steered the bombs directly into a specific target location that had been identified for offering the highest chance of success. Depending on the need, two B-2s could strike a specific point in the mountain complex with upwards of 120,000 pounds of bunker-busting power in rapid succession, laying waste to the underground facilities and sending any Iranian defenses not already on high alert into a frenzy. From there, it would be a very stressful mad dash for the border, flying along a different but similarly meticulously planned route out of Iranian airspace before settling in for a long flight home or diverting toward friendly airstrips in Europe or Australia. The B-2 Spirit's stealthy design and radar-absorbent skin would go a long way toward rounding off the sharper edges of Iranian air defenses, but fighter intercepts would still be a significant concern. But despite the stress these pilots would endure, a look inside the cockpit might fool you into thinking that there just wasn't much going on at all. Unlike the action-packed combat operations we see in the movies, a well-planned stealth bomber mission, with the added benefit of a bit of luck, would look to an outside party like a pretty boring road trip in the cockpit. But for the Iranian troops and nuclear researchers who thought they were safe some 300 feet below the Earth, well, it would be a very different story. And with that ends yet another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure to swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below, and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And of course, don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.